In 1959, a small aerospace subsidiary called Armalite sold the manufacturing rights to a rifle for what amounted to a pittance, a royalty deal plus a flat fee. The buyer was Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, already 123 years old and the most famous name in American guns. The rifle was the AR-15. Over the next half-century, Colt would build millions of them, arm the entire United States military with its derivatives, and then, through a combination of labor strife, bureaucratic complacency, and financial mismanagement, lose the contract to a Belgian company that hadn't even made the design. The company that owned the most important military rifle of the 20th century filed for bankruptcy twice. That story starts on a ship. Samuel Colt was 15 years old in 1830, working as a deckhand on the brig Corvo, bound from Boston for Calcutta. The accepted story is that he studied the ship's capstan, the way the drum could rotate freely and then lock into a fixed position, and carved a wooden model of a revolving cylinder. Some historians think he may have also seen a Collier flintlock revolver while the ship docked on the Thames. Whatever the inspiration, by the time he came home, he had a concept no one else had made work. A cylinder that rotated and locked in alignment with a single barrel, fired by cocking a hammer. He filed his first U.S. patent in February 1836 and founded the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company in Paterson, New Jersey, the same year. Paterson was a disaster. The factory was ambitious, a 4-story brownstone at the base of the Great Falls, and Colt's idea of interchangeable parts was ahead of the tooling available to execute it. The Marines and the Army tested his revolvers and complained about quality. Between 1836 and 1842, the factory produced roughly 2,350 pistols, 1,450 rifles and carbines, and 462 shotguns. Respectable numbers for a new firm, but not enough. Government contracts never materialized in volume. By 1842, the Patent Arms Manufacturing Company was bankrupt, its assets sold at auction. Samuel Colt was 28 and had no factory. What he did have was a design that had been tested in the one place that mattered. In Texas, Captain Jack Hayes and his Rangers had carried Paterson revolvers against Comanche raiding parties. At Walker's Creek in 1844, a small mounted force used those revolvers to defeat a larger opposing group at close range. The lesson was simple and violent. A man on horseback with a Colt could fire 6 times before needing to reload. Before the revolver, reloading a single-shot pistol took roughly 20 seconds. The Paterson collapsed the gap between shots to the time it took to cock a hammer. 4 years after bankruptcy, the Mexican-American War broke out, and Captain Samuel Walker of the Texas Rangers tracked Colt down. Walker wanted a bigger, heavier revolver, more powerful, simpler to load, and strong enough to survive hard use. Colt had no factory, so he contracted with Eli Whitney Jr. in New Haven to produce the first 1,000. The Walker Colt was a beast, a .44 caliber, 6-shot revolver weighing 4.5 pounds. The government order was for 1,000 units. Everyone was delivered by 1847. That contract saved Samuel Colt. He used the revenue to open a new factory in Hartford, Connecticut, first a leased building on Pearl Street, then, by 1855, a purpose-built armory on the banks of the Connecticut River. He bought the riverside land cheap because it flooded regularly, then built a 2-mile dike to hold the water back. The factory itself was the real product. Colt hired Elisha Root as superintendent, and together they built something that would influence American manufacturing far beyond firearms, a fully integrated production system using roughly 400 specialized machines, precision gauges, and jigs that allowed semi-skilled workers to assemble revolvers from truly interchangeable parts. By 1856, the Hartford Armory could produce 150 weapons a day. It was the largest privately owned armament factory in the world. The machines that made those guns were built by mechanics who would later found Pratt & Whitney. The revolving cylinder was Colt's invention. The factory was his revolution. During the Civil War, Colt's armory ran flat out, fulfilling some of the largest Union contracts for revolvers and rifle muskets. But Samuel Colt didn't see the war end. He died in January 1862 at 47, one of the richest men in America. His estate was worth approximately $15 million, an almost incomprehensible fortune for the time. His wife, Elizabeth Jarvis Colt, inherited controlling interest and kept the company running through one of its worst crises. On February 4, 1864, fire broke out in the factory attic. Workers rushed to fight it, but the hoses had no water pressure. The blaze destroyed the building. The cause was never determined, though rumors of Confederate arson persisted for years. Elizabeth had insured the property. She rebuilt. The next great Colt arrived in 1873, and it was designed not by Samuel but by two of the company's engineers, William Mason and Charles Brinkerhoff Richards. The single-action army, the Peacemaker, was a response to the Army's 1872 service revolver trials. Colt had been locked out of the bored-through cylinder design by the Rollin White patent, which Smith & Wesson controlled until 1869. Once it expired, Mason and Richards built a revolver with a solid frame, a top strap for strength, and a cylinder chambered for the new .45 Colt centerfire cartridge. It was simple, balanced, and nearly indestructible. The Army adopted it. Between 1873 and 1891, Colt shipped over 37,000 single-action armies to the U.S. government alone, and nearly 100,000 more went to civilian and foreign military customers. By 1877, Colt chambered the Peacemaker in .44-40 Winchester, which meant a man on the frontier could carry one box of ammunition for both his revolver and his Winchester .73 lever-action rifle. Through 1940, total production of the first-generation single-action Army reached 357,859, a revolver so fundamentally right in its proportions that Colt has discontinued it twice and brought it back both times because demand never died. But the Peacemaker was a single-action revolver, and by the turn of the century, the future was in autoloaders. That future walked through Colt's door in the person of John Moses Browning. What Browning brought to Hartford was a self-loading pistol based on the short-recoil principle. Barrel and slide traveled rearward together, locked by lugs, until the barrel tilted down to unlock. The slide continued back, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round on the return stroke. The catalyst for adoption was the Philippine-American War, where .38 caliber revolvers couldn't stop Moro fighters. The 1904 Thompson-Lagarde tests concluded that nothing smaller than .45 caliber would suffice. Browning scaled his design to the new .45 ACP cartridge and submitted it for trials. In late 1910, 6 manufacturers had been narrowed to 2, Colt and Savage. 6,000 rounds were fired through a single Colt pistol over 2 days. When the gun overheated, they dunked it in water and kept firing. 0 malfunctions. The Savage had 37. On March 29, 1911, the Army adopted the Colt as the model of 1911. It would remain the standard-issue sidearm for 74 years, roughly 2.7 million M1911 and M1911. A1 pistols were procured across that service life. Colt produced hundreds of thousands, but the design was so good that production was licensed to Remington Rand, Ithaca, Union Switch and Signal, and even Singer Sewing Machine Company. Browning's short-recoil tilting barrel system became the dominant operating principle for semi-automatic pistols worldwide. It still is. With the Peacemaker and the 1911, Colt had produced arguably the 2 most iconic American firearms ever made. The company entered the mid-20th century as the prestige name in the industry. In 1955, it introduced the Python, a .357 Magnum revolver with a ventilated rib barrel, and a double-action trigger pull so smooth it became the benchmark for production revolvers. But the decision that would define Colt's next era and ultimately contribute to its unraveling came in 1959, when the company purchased the manufacturing and marketing rights to the AR-15 from Armalite. Armalite was a small division of Fairchild Engine and Aircraft Corporation. Its chief engineer, Eugene Stoner, had designed the AR-10, a select-fire rifle in 7.62 NATO that was radical in every dimension. Aluminum receivers instead of steel, fiberglass furniture instead of walnut, stock in line with the bore to reduce muzzle rise, and instead of a conventional gas piston, a tube carried propellant gas directly to a chamber inside the bolt carrier, where the bolt itself acted as the piston. Stoner called it a true expanding gas system. Everyone else called it direct impingement. The AR-10 lost to the M14 in Army trials, but the concept survived. Stoner's assistants scaled it down to fire the .223 Remington, and the AR-15 was born. Armalite sold the rights to Colt when it couldn't justify the production investment. Colt redesigned the rifle for mass production, relocated the charging handle from under the carrying handle to the rear of the receiver, and began selling it to military customers. In 1961, Air Force General Curtis LeMay saw a demonstration and ordered 8,500 rifles. In 1962, 1,000 AR-15s were shipped to Army Special Forces and South Vietnamese troops in-country, where they earned enthusiastic reviews for their lightweight, low recoil, and lethality. The 5.56 millimeter round tumbled on impact, producing wound channels that shocked observers accustomed to the neat punctures of 7.62 NATO. In November 1963, the Army and Air Force ordered 104,000 rifles. The AR-15, now designated the M16, went into full production in March 1964. Then the rifle went to war, and war exposed a catastrophe, not of design, but of decisions made around the design. The Army switched the ammunition from the DuPont YMR stick powder the rifle was designed for to Olin Matheson WC-846 ball powder, a cheaper propellant. The ball powder burned dirtier, changed the pressure curve, and increased the cyclic rate by over 200 rounds per minute. The bolt carrier tried to extract spent casings before chamber pressure had dropped, ripping rims and jamming the action. The Army had also refused to chrome plate the chamber, a modification Stoner, Armalite, and Colt had all recommended, and in Vietnam's humidity, bare steel corroded fast. Rifles were issued without cleaning kits or manuals, partly because Colt had marketed the gas system as self-cleaning. Units reported failure rates as high as 30%. Soldiers died with jammed rifles. Some carried captured AK-47s instead. By 1967, the Army finally chrome-plated chambers, added a heavier buffer, and issued cleaning kits. The improved M16A1 gradually earned trust. By 1969, it replaced the M14 as the standard service rifle. But Colt's role was ambiguous. The company had warned the Army about the ball powder, yet it had never refused to ship rifles it knew would be paired with incompatible ammunition. Vietnam made the M16 famous and made Colt rich, but it also planted the seeds of dependency. Colt's business was increasingly built on government contracts, and when Vietnam wound down in the early 1970s, so did the orders. The company pivoted toward sporting guns, generating $17 million in rifle and revolver revenue in 1970. By 1977, the firearms division reported $11 million in profit on $77 million in sales. But the real money was in military procurement, and Colt was about to learn what happens when you take that money for granted. In 1985, Colt's workers, members of the United Auto Workers, went on strike for higher wages. It would become one of the longest labor strikes in Connecticut history, lasting 5 years. Colt kept the lines running with replacement workers. Quality dropped. The military noticed. In 1988, the U.S. Army awarded its M16 production contract not to Colt but to FN Manufacturing, the American subsidiary of Belgium's Fabrique Nationale. The company that had bought the AR-15 redesigned it, produced it by the millions, and shipped it to every branch of the U.S. military had lost its own rifle. The strike ended in March 1990, but the damage was compounding. Colt's handgun line had grown stale while the market moved to high-capacity 9mm autoloaders. The Glock 17 was eating law enforcement alive. Colt tried to modernize with the Double Eagle in 1989 and the All-American Model 2000 in 1992. A polymer-framed 9mm whose execution was so poor it was recalled and pulled from the market by 1994. Colt filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1992. The company clawed its way out. It developed the M4 carbine, a shortened, collapsible stock derivative of the M16 that was adopted in 1994 and became Colt's bread and butter through the global war on terror. For more than a decade, Colt was the sole M4 manufacturer. Government contracts at one point accounted for 60% of revenue. But sole-source contracts breed complacency. Colt stopped innovating. Delta Force replaced its M4s with the HK416 in 2004 after tests showed the piston system significantly reduced malfunctions. On the civilian side, Bushmaster outsold Colt in AR-15S and successfully defended itself in court when Colt tried to claim M4 as a trademark. In 2013, Colt lost the M4 contract entirely. The $77 million deal went to FN Manufacturing. Government revenue plummeted from 60% of sales to less than 10%. On June 15, 2015, Colt filed for bankruptcy again, listing debts up to $500 million. Colt emerged from bankruptcy in January 2016 and began, tentatively, to rebuild. It reintroduced the Cobra revolver in 2017, the King Cobra in 2019, and in 2020, it brought back the Python, the revolver that had defined what a production point .357 Magnum could be. Early production guns had quality issues that drew sharp criticism from the same community whose nostalgia Colt was banking on. Later production improved, the guns sold. But Colt no longer had the capital or the market position to stand alone. In 2021, Česká zbrojovka Group, the Czech firearms conglomerate that makes the CZ-75 and owns Dan Wesson, acquired Colt for $220 million in cash plus stock. The company that had armed the Union Army, defined the American frontier, given the U.S. military its sidearm for 3/4 of a century, and built the rifle platform that remains the global standard, was now a subsidiary of a Czech holding company. The Hartford armory where Samuel Colt built his empire still stands, its blue onion dome visible from the Connecticut River. It's a National Historic Landmark now. No guns are made there. The factory floor where Elisha Root's machines once stamped out interchangeable parts for 150 revolvers a day is quiet. Production moved to West Hartford years ago, and the future of the brand belongs to Brno, not Hartford. The rampant Colt, the little horse that has stamped Colt products since the 1850s, still appears on every gun that leaves the factory. It's the oldest continuously used firearms trademark in America, pressed into the frame of a Python that retails for $1,500 and is made by a company that a 22-year-old failed entrepreneur from Connecticut started with a wooden model he carved on a sailing ship almost 200 years ago.